This is Gerry Fry, audio historian of Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. The following is the professional history of a PPB member told by himself in his own fashion on June the 7th of 2010. We're in Toluca Lake, California. These interviews are being recorded in order to compile firsthand a living history of the members of our organization and stories of their professional experiences. Many of our members began in what is called the golden age of radio and television, and this is an attempt to preserve as much data as possible for succeeding generations. This recording is not intended for broadcast without first obtaining permission from Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. With me today in Burbank, or Toluca Lake, or however you look, I'm never quite sure what the boundary is one of those golden age of broadcasters broadcaster, a guy by the name of Steve Binder. Steve, I think every show I ever watched in the 1950s or 1960s or 70s had your name attached to it somewhere, either as a producer or director. But we're going to start before that and go back to when you were born, where you were born, when, and where.
I was born in Los Angeles. I grew up on the west side, right near a huge park called La Cienega Park. And we had a rule in my home with my mother, father, and older sister that at 7 o'clock, when you were not home, you missed dinner for the evening.
Really?
And I missed countless dinners because I was always playing football in the park.
Did they stick to that? You didn't get fed if you weren't there?
That was our rule.
Wow.
We had a family dinner, and it was a great way to grow up.
Sure.
Because you had great conversations and bonded.
They don't do that very often anymore, I'm told.
That's true.
No, too bad.
My father had a truck station in downtown Los Angeles called Brody Brothers. And my mother was a housewife, and my older sister actually became a school teacher. She was a graduate of UCLA and taught at UCLA in their Fresnel school for years.
What part of LA did you say?
West Los Angeles,
West LA.
La Cienega and Olympic, to be specific.
Okay. Things are different down there than they were when you were growing up, I suppose, now.
Not so much.
No?
I think my father, when he bought the home, was about, I think he paid around $5,500 for it. Today it's over $1 million, and they haven't done any improvement on the outside that I can see.
Now, you were growing up in that area. You went to grade school and high school down there?
I went to Carthay Center Grammar School, John Burroughs Junior High School, McCadden and Wilshire, and Los Angeles High School, and started my college education at the University of Southern California, thinking not necessarily that I wanted to be a doctor. I enrolled in pre-med, and it was just because my parents had sacrificed so much for my sister and I to have a good education that I felt I owed it to them to become something professional. So I chose to get into medicine, even though knowing when I was in high school I was very squeamish when they dissected frogs and rabbits.
Yeah, smelling that formaldehyde.
Exactly. I never dreamed I was going to get in the entertainment business. It never was a desire of mine, to be honest with you. I worked starting when I was in high school. I used to take the bus downtown to my dad's gas station, and I pumped gasoline and changed tires in my youth. It wasn't until I went to the university that I read a little article where they started with the Allen Hancock Foundation, actually, it wasn't even television in those days. It was they had a radio station, KUSC, and
still around today.
And I actually ended up as a radio announcer for KUSC, announcing both on their local station and their sister station was an AM/FM station playing classical music, KFAC, and I would go to the LA County Museum where they would have Franz Waxman and his chamber music, and I was announcing on AM radio while I was a student at USC the chamber music concerts.
Really? You just volunteered for that purpose, or how did they find you?
Yeah, I volunteered to work on KUSC, and they hired me, and it just turned out, to me, it was just a lot of fun. I was enjoying it a lot, and as much as I could, I would, as a matter of fact, I remember, they didn't have many rules in those days, and we kind of programmed ourselves, and I used to read short stories on the air, as a matter of fact.
How did you? I didn't realize, first of all, that KFAC was affiliated with USC.
Yeah, I still have some of the scripts at home.
And did they sell it then later on to?
No, it was on the air. It was. Can't even tell you if it was commercialized, but I just know it was broadcast on AM and FM on KFAC. And my big problem or dilemma was trying to learn the pronunciations of all these classical composers and musicians.
Yeah, that was always a tongue twister.
Yes.
But something that we all had to do as young announcers.
And then I got hired at USC in one of their departments was doing documentaries for the Air Force. And my first professional job, which was a big deal to me because I couldn't believe I was having so much fun and they wanted to pay me too, but I was narrating training films for the Air Force. And it wasn't that many years ago where I was on campus teaching in their cinema department and ran into somebody who actually remembered being part of that staff when they hired me.
Oh my gosh. Wow. It's fun when you run into people like that who can remember.
Absolutely. Then I realized early on that I didn't particularly want to go into medicine as a professional career, and my mother is the one who encouraged me to take electives in their telecommunications department, and along with my required studies in my first 2 years as a freshman and a sophomore, I started to take some classes at USC in writing in the arts. And at that time, Allen Hancock Foundation was the principal broadcast building on the campus. And they were the originators, I assumed, of pay television in California, starting up a television station. And I remember getting dressed up with a sport jacket and tie and auditioning as an announcer to go on their television station, and I didn't make it actually, but the reason given, they thought I was way too young, but they ended up putting the station on the air. And I remember distinctly in those days saying the biggest mistake they made was calling it educational television.
Yeah.
They avoided the word education, they might have immediately got more viewers, and but it was exciting to just see television cameras and see the whole setup, etc.
Where were their studios?
In the building, on campus.
Oh, on campus.
The Allen Hancock Foundation.
And this was Channel 28?
It was basically, I guess, the precursor to KCET.
KCET,
yeah,
Channel
exactly. And then it was a case of where the Korean War was raging at the time. And I was in the Air Cadet program at USC, and I had signed a 2-year contract, and I had to go to classes and wear an Air Force uniform. And they came to all of us students and said because of the Korean War that they wanted to increase our contracts from 2 years to 4 years. And they wanted us to sign a new agreement. And when I spoke to my folks about it, my dad said, at your age, I think I was 18 or something, he said, you have no concept of how long a year is. No. So you better think twice.
Yeah.
And so I decided, I had gone, already I was in my junior year at USC, going into my senior year, and I had decided at that time that I was going to drop out of the Air Cadet program. And I was immediately drafted for the Korean War.
Really, that fast?
It was within literally, and I may be off a month or two, but it seemed like the minute I resigned, and they even, I think, wanted me to pay them back for the books and the uniform and what have you. But I was drafted in the Army, and then I my brother-in-law knew somebody at the Armed Forces radio and service in Hollywood at McCadden Place, I believe it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I went up there. I made a contact with him, a gentleman who I owe my career as a military broadcaster to, Bob Goodman, who was a civilian who was working up there. He auditioned me as a radio announcer and gave me a letter from the Armed Forces radio. I don't think television was even.
No, not those.
In those days, it was just radio.
Yeah.
He gave me a wonderful, with their stationery and letterhead, and he gave me a recommendation, high recommendation, to be an announcer when I went into the military. And so I had my letter with me, and I had to report to Fort Ord, California. And I ended up in King of the 20th, which was an infantry basic training unit. And after I had completed my 8 weeks of basic training, they wanted to send me to Texas to take advanced medical training as basically a frontline medic. And so I came home for a weekend pass before I had to report to Fort Sam Houston in Texas. And Bob Goodman called me up out of the blue, heard I was home, and said, "Come on up here. Colonel Turteltaub is here from the Blue Danube Network in Austria, and I'd like to introduce you to him." So I rushed up to McCadden Place, and the colonel was very, very nice. He wanted to know my name, rank, and serial number, and I shook his hand, and that was the end of it. I ended up going to Fort Sam for 8 weeks of continued basic training, advanced training, and then they shipped me in the medical corps to Fort Lewis, Washington, and I thought I was on my way to Korea.
Sure. What was the advanced training in? Medical?
No, the advanced, it was totally a medical corps, and we learned how to give each other shots, and et cetera, and physical training. And so by the end of the 16 weeks, I probably remember it as the best physical condition I was ever in my life.
Sure.
And I went to Fort Lewis, and the minute I got there, I knew I didn't want to be in the medical corps, so I snuck into the PIO office, Public Information Office, and I met a captain who was sort of running it at that time, and I introduced myself, and the minute he heard the word Hollywood, his eyes lit up, because I think he was from Georgia or some deep south city. And he said, "Well, I want you in my unit in the Public Information Office." So he cut orders that I was transferred out of the medical corps into his unit. And I was assigned to go drive into Seattle every week to go on a public service television show representing Fort Lewis and the Army.
Oh.
And a sort of a informational show on the weekend. And that lasted for about 4 or 5 weeks, and I thought I had the job of all jobs.
You were on camera for the show?
I was on camera with a group of other people, local citizens, and all giving public information. And then, out of the blue, the captain calls me to his office, and he is beet red and totally angry at me. And I said, "What's wrong?" And he's sitting there with new orders for me from Colonel Turteltaub, ordering me to Austria to report to the Blue Danube Network.
Too bad.
And I was so bad in geography, I thought I was going to Australia when I heard the country Austria. And so I had an MOS to be a radio announcer for the Blue Danube Network. We went by ship on a little Greek boat that the Army had leased from the Greek shipping industry or something. It was it was a small boat. I remember we went out of Bayonne, New Jersey, in the dead of winter in January when all the storms were happening in the Atlantic. And I don't think anybody on that entire ship didn't get seasick. And I was one of the last holdouts because I was used to being on small boats, but I never ever experienced anything like that. And I think it was watching everybody else be sick is what eventually got to me.
Sure.
And we landed in Leghorn, Italy, and then there we were lined up on the beach, and they were processing us, and I brought my letter with me, and I had my orders, and the guy sitting at the table burst out laughing, and he said, "Hey, we don't have any MOSs like this." And so he went to talk to his superior, and he came back and said, "Okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to give you a weekend, a 2-day train trip up to Salzburg. You can go to BDN in Salzburg. If they want to keep you, they will notify us, and if they don't, come on back here and we'll assign you to a infantry unit or a medical corps unit." And so I got on a train, went up to Salzburg, walked into the headquarters of BDN, and there was a sergeant sitting behind the desk. And he looked at my orders, he looked at me, and he said, "I'll be damned." And he got on the phone, he called Colonel Turtletop, and he said, "Remember that guy you told me you were going to, try and bring to our radio station? Well, he's standing in front of me right now." And I spent this fantastic about 8 months in Salzburg. And then Salzburg, Austria, the country of Austria, was a divided city between France, Russia, England, and the United States. And all of a sudden one day...
Just like Berlin, huh?
Exactly.
I didn't know that.
And Vienna was they used to ride around in jeeps with all 4 countries represented with the MPs. And all of a sudden the 4 nations decided to give Austria back to the Austrians. So we were ordered within days of packing up the radio station and moving out into Germany. And so I ended up in Göppingen, Germany, which was a processing center for the infantry.
That's near where? Göppingen?
It would be somewhere near the border of
Austria.
As you cross Austria into Germany. And they immediately ordered us to take off any identification we had of BDN, and they didn't want any esprit de corps because we all felt we were very special when we were there.
How many were you assigned?
There were about, the entire radio station had about 8 radio announcers and then a full staff and so forth. And I thought it was going to be an automatic getting into AFN, the American Forces Network, and it turned out it wasn't. And so the same exact thing happened when I was at Göppingen. I snuck out to the office and tried to convince them I should at least get my chance to get to Frankfurt and meet the AFN people. And I guess I was convincing enough where they gave me a pass. Told me, same story. If they keep you, they'll send us the orders, and if they don't, come on back.
Right.
So I ended up going to Frankfurt by train. I stopped in Heidelberg on the way, spent an evening there. Got to Frankfurt, and I reported in, told them my story, my hardship story. And there was a really nice commanding officer there, and he got on his walkie-talkie and he said, "Steve, there's a Northern Command and a Southern Command. We happen to be in the Northern Command, and I've got to convince the Southern Command to let you go to come up here."
Oh my gosh.
So he got on his walkie-talkie, and he had very difficult time, whoever he was talking to on the other end, and he wanted to know my serial number and my rank, and he was giving this guy the information. And he finally hung up and he said, "Well, I've done the best I can do. If you get back to Göppingen and they have your new orders, I'll see you in a few days back here. If not, we did our best, and you'll be in the infantry." So I went back to Göppingen, another 2 days of train travel, and I had to sneak out to go back to the office to see if they had my orders there. And I told him my name, and the clerk, and he went back and looked it up, and he said, "I'm sorry, Steve, but there are no orders for you." And so I turned around, totally depressed, walking out the door, and I said, "Did you spell my name B-I-N-D-E-R?" And he said, "No, I looked under B-E-N-D-E-R."
Oh,
I said,
BINDER.
"Well, would you do me a favor and look under B-I-N-D-E-R?" And he looked, and there were my orders, and I immediately got on a train, went back to Frankfurt.
Boy.
Spent a little bit of time there. I got to meet Nick Clooney, who was one of the and I was a big fan of Rosemary, his sister, and so forth. And I loved the Heidelberg Castle. I mean, the Frankfurt Castle. Exactly. And I spent no more than 2 or 3 weeks. I never got a announcing assignment in Frankfurt. And then they cut orders to send me to Munich. And I was an announcer for about another 6-8 months in Munich. I did the Luncheon in München show every day. I did the Munich Night Train show, and I loved it. It was an incredible.
Gosh, you've only been in Europe for a few weeks, and you've already seen Salzburg, and now you've seen
and that
Heidelberg,
wasn't the half of it.
And then Munich.
Then I got a call from my commanding officer, and he said, "You used to play a lot of sports, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, there's a general in Nuremberg who hates the sports announcers on AFN, and he'd like me to transfer you to Nuremberg so you can do the football games," which is exactly what happened. And I hated going to Nuremberg because I was having a wonderful time in Munich.
Sure. I
was sort of adopted. My surrogate parents were a husband and wife named Gerry Hausner and his wife Velma. And Gerry was the voice with Jim Backus of Mr. Magoo shorts, and they took me under their wing, and I really loved having dinner at their house. And I lived in a hotel near 15 Kolbachstrasse in Munich.
These were German people living there?
No, these were Americans, and they were working for Radio Free Europe.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And Gerry was the sidekick to Jim Backus. They did a lot of radio shows, and Gerry did tons of Lucille Ball shows, and he was an actor.
Yeah, that name is familiar to me that you mentioned it.
And anyway, when I heard I had to go to Nuremberg, I was very disappointed because I was breaking up this wonderful lifestyle I was having.
Sure.
And he told me, which are words I've taken for the rest of my life, he said, "Steve, this is a great thing that's happening because for every door that closes, a new one opens." And I've always remembered that because I had a wonderful time in Nuremberg. I announced football, and I also did some radio shows while I was there. And I had a choice when my time was up and it was time to come back to the United States. I was offered a job at Radio Free Europe, and I really, really seriously considered it, but I chose to come back. But I was armed with names of people to contact in radio in Hollywood. So I had Jim Backus's personal phone number. I had a wonderful director named Pete Burness, who was the director of the Mr. Magoo cartoons and also the Gerald McBoing Boing cartoons, etc. As soon as I got back and I was determined I wanted to be in radio, I called up both Mr. Backus and Mr. Burness, and Jim was very friendly, and little did I know a few years later I'd be directing him in Gilligan's Island. But it was Pete Burness who really picked up the torch and said, "I'll take you to CBS and we'll meet the program director who's a friend of mine, and we'll see if he can get you into radio." So I met up in Hollywood on Sunset Boulevard at the CBS studios, and we went into his big plush office, and they exchanged niceties for a few minutes. And then he turned to me and he said, "So is your dad Art Linkletter?" And I looked at him and said, "I don't know what you mean." He said, "I'm asking you if your dad's Art Linkletter." And I said, "No, my dad has a gas station downtown Los Angeles." He said, "Well, the reason I'm asking you that question, if your dad's not Art Linkletter or you're not related to anybody, pick another profession, kid."
Oh, really?
And that was the end of the meeting. And so I walked out, and Pete apologized to me about the meeting. And I think it stimulated me where I said, you know what, I'm going to prove this guy wrong.
Yeah. And what did he base that comment on? Was that his approach to anybody who wanted to get into business? Or
I don't know what his motivation was. Quite possibly. I just don't know. I just hit him on a bad day or whatever, but he just wasn't interested in lifting a finger to help me or give me any advice or anything.
Yeah.
So the next thing I did was enrolled back in USC and try and finish my education there. But a friend of mine who I'd gone to high school with was, by that time, he was one of the editors on Star Trek at ABC, at Paramount, I think it was. And he said to me, "Steve, if you want to meet a lot of pretty girls, you should really try and get a job in the mailroom at one of the studios. You'll have a lot of fun." And because I couldn't get right back into school, it was summertime, and so I took his advice and I went over to CBS and I filled out their application, and there was a typist job. And in those days they had mimeograph machines and typewriters.
Yep.
And I was not a very good typist, but I put down that I could type pretty fast. And then I went over to this, there was CBS, there was NBC, and then there was this small network called ABC on Prospect and Talmadge. And I went over there, and I kind of liked the atmosphere because there were no big fences. There was one guard shack, and they didn't seem to be very strict on who walked in the studio lot and who didn't. And the next day, I got 2 phone calls. I got a call from CBS asking if I wanted to be a typist for them. And then 2 minutes later, I got a call from ABC saying, "Do I want to be in the mailroom?" And so I decided that I wasn't a very good typist, so I would take a shot at this place in Hollywood in Las Feliz that seemed a lot friendlier to me and less formal. And
That's interesting. In those days, typists were generally female, but they were hiring males in that job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I went out to ABC. I turned down the CBS job, told them I didn't want to do it. Went to ABC, and then I was sent to the mailroom, and there was a guy who was the head of the mailroom. And I'll never forget him. I can describe him to a T and what he physically looked like. And he made me swear almost on a stack of Bibles that I never ever wanted to do anything in life but work for him in the mailroom. That was his. He didn't want me taking the job and leaving.
That was the pinnacle.
That was the test of whether I would get this job or not.
Yeah.
And so I lied. I said, "That's all I want to do is just get a job here." And I knew in my head it was only going to be a summer job anyway because I was going back to school. And so I started delivering mail at KABC. And their big claim to fame at that time was the Lawrence Welk Show and the Mike Wallace Interview. Those were their 2 big shows on the network. And I learned my first lesson about television. They spent 3 days on the commercials and 2 days on the shows. And so I was delivering mail, and there was a real friendly lady who ran the mimeograph department. And she said, we talked, I talked to everybody when I was handing out the mail and so forth. And everybody was very friendly. And she in particular said, "What are you doing here?" And I told her my brief life story. And she said, "Well, it sounds to me like you'd have a lot of fun if you were in programming." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, being a director or..." I said, "Yeah, good luck." She said, No. She said, "Let me introduce you to Pete Robinson and Seligman. They run KABC, and I think they'd like you." And so, and I was delivering mail to them anyway.
Yeah.
And so I got it. She set up an interview for me. And she said, "You know what, Steve?" She said, "If you come to work for me in the mimeograph department, I will try and set up a meeting with Seligman and Robinson." And so I did. I quit. The mailroom head was like, "I told you." I was, I knew this was going to happen, etc. But off I went to the mimeograph department. I was the best mimeograph operator in the entire history of KBC. She told me that. She said, "We had nobody in here who was faster or more conscientious or efficient or whatever."
I bet you can still remember the smell of that ink, too.
Oh, I sure can. and all those carbons in between the papers.
Yeah.
And so I went and met Selig and Peter, and Selig sat at this huge desk, and his chair was elevated, so you felt like you were 4 feet tall when you sat down to talk to him, looking up at him behind the desk. And he said, "Okay, son, what would you if you had anything that you'd like to be doing, what would you like to be doing now? And I said, I'd like to be sitting in your chair interviewing you. And I guess he liked the comment.
He got it.
And the next thing I know, I was offered a summer replacement to a director who became a friend of mine, Norman Abbott, who was part of the Abbott and Costello. He was part of that family.
Oh,
whether he was a nephew or whatever.
Yeah.
And he was leaving to go do the Bob Crosby show and the Jack Benny show at CBS, and they needed a replacement. And I was offered a local directing job for the summer. I didn't know anything about directing. And so I figured the worst that will happen, I'll end up losing my job, period, and just going back to school. And so I ended up directing, they had a jazz show that was very famous called Stars of Jazz with Bobby Troup and many of the major jazz stars. I did Chucko the Clown. I did Al Jarvis's Make Believe Ballroom. It was the dance contest.
You
were
directing these?
I was directing them.
Now, who taught you? Who gave you the basics of
Well,
what you have to do?
Norm Abbott was supposed to teach me, and I swear to you, when I walked into a control booth the first day, it was like trying to learn Chinese in a week.
Yeah.
It was all foreign to me when they were talking about setup, dissolve, cut, all the control room talk.
Sure.
The second day, it deciphered. I just knew, I knew the job better than Norman.
You were a natural.
In a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Then he'd been doing it for years, and it was amazing. And so I became the youngest director, I guess, in certainly in network television history.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a show called Soupy Sales where we threw a lot of pies.
Yes, you did.
And then what happened is that Soupy was so popular that he got picked up on the network. So I went from being a local KABC director to being a full network director.
Mm-hmm.
There was a executive at ABC who was in charge of all the network directors, and he was gone in Pebble Beach doing a golf tournament when I got hired. And the first show we did for Soupy was with Frank Sinatra as the guest. The second one was with Mickey Rooney. The third one was with Tony Curtis. And so I'd done 3 weeks on the network plus 5 days a week on KABC, continuing on with Soupy. And then this executive came back from Pebble Beach saying, "What do you mean a local director is doing the network show?" He immediately wanted a network director to do it. So I was fired off the network show, but told I can continue doing the local show. And he brought in Bob Henry, who also became a friend of mine, but Bob Henry was a network television director. And Bob called me and said, "I'm replacing you on the network show. Can you tell me what's the show?" And I had to kind of explain to him how to direct the Soupy Sales show.
Mm-hmm.
And I got so infuriated that I quit.
Oh, you did?
I wrote Leonard Goldenson, I think, who was the chairman of ABC in those years.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him that I thought it was such an unfair decision. They're going to fire me off the local show too, but to bring somebody else in to do the network show is ludicrous.
Mm-hmm.
And so I resigned, and I left ABC.
And you had been there how long at this point?
Probably 6 months.
So, and you had nothing beyond that.
Nothing beyond that.
So that was quite a gamble.
Well, my stage manager for Soupy was like a lifer at ABC, and he was doing both network shows and local shows. And he called me up and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Nothing." And he said, "I'm doing the Steve Allen variety show on ABC Network, and it just got canceled. And Steve is so infuriated that he would like to finance a jazz show. And I think I can convince him to use you as the director." I said, "Great." And he went to Steve. I never met Steve Allen. And Steve asked to see me, and I went out and met him. liked him. And immediately he called me Steve-O, and so I knew there was a relationship, which he called me my whole career, basically. Whenever we ran into each other, it was always Steve-O.
Steve-O.
And he said he was financing a show, 26 half-hour show, which was going to be syndicated by Desi Liu, called Jazz Scene USA, hosted by Oscar Brown Jr. And it would have everybody on it from Nancy Wilson, Stan Kenton's Big Band, the Jazz Messengers, Shorty Rogers, etc. And I did 3 half hours a day at CBS with the old Playhouse 90 technical crew. And I never got to rehearse any of them. I would just on the weekends figure out what the music bar counts were, so I would know which the solo instruments would be playing and how long they'd be playing for. And I would plot out what camera would be on. I think it was 3 cameras in those days. And we did 26 half hours. Well, about 12 shows in, I got a call from Steve, and he said, listen, I just made a deal with Westinghouse to do a late night, 90-minute, 5-day-a-week show on Vine Street, across street from it's called the Hollywood Ranch Market. It was open 24/7.
1313 Vine, huh?
You got it. No, it was south of that.
Oh, south of that.
It was south of Sunset Boulevard.
Okay.
It was where the old Groucho Marx, it was a film studio. It was a theater.
Yeah.
And he used to do You Bet Your Life from there,
Right.
which was one of the great disappointments of my life, because when I went down into the basement of the theater, there were cue cards, meaning that it was all scripted. And so we started the Steve Allen Westinghouse show, and our little street between the market and our theater was La Mirada, and that became our home base when we went outside the theater to do lots and lots of stunts, like Steve falling into a swimming pool of Jell-O, and we did so many tricks out there, and Vine Street became my home.
Sure.
And we used to do 2 shows, 2 90-minute shows on Wednesday and Friday, and 1 show on Thursday. So we packed it all into 3 days. And it was probably to this day the most fun I ever had working in show business. And I mean, I couldn't wait to wake up in the morning and go to the studio and do the shows. And so I was bicycling between doing the jazz show at CBS and doing the Steve Allen show. And originally I told Steve I couldn't do it because I was so busy doing the jazz show. And he said, well, why don't you get me started, and then I'll get somebody to replace you. And then 2 years later, 2.5 years later,
you were having too much fun.
I was having way too much fun.
Yeah.
And
now, videotape wasn't all that old at that point. It was fairly new.
Well, we shot live on videotape. It was brand new at the time. In fact, we were a black and white show. They hadn't even invented color in those days. And so I finished the 26 half hours, and then I devoted full time. Well, a writer for the LA Times, Cecil Smith, got a kick out of what I was doing, and he wrote this amazing article in the Times on me with my picture, and the guy who has most fun, doing 2 shows at the same time, etc. And that kind of opened up the door to a lot of my future, because 5 nights a week I met everybody in the entertainment business with all the guest stars we poured through the Steve Allen show.
So was that a stepping stone toward Hullabaloo, for instance?
Well, that was way before, actually. What happened before Hullabaloo was I was approached by a producer named Bill Sargent, and when videotape came in, everybody forgot about kinescope. Bill Sargent was a pioneer, and he thought that electronic pictures done with high definition on digi would be the future of motion pictures, because it was going to be a lot cheaper to produce them. And his vision came to pass. I mean, now, today in the movie business, even George Lucas did Star Wars using electronic cameras.
Right.
But in those days, it was just experimental. So the first project I did for Bill Sargent was when the government passed the segregation desegregation of schools in the United States. This was the George Wallace days, where they did not want blacks in the South going to white schools and so forth.
Yeah.
And they had to bring the U.S. Army in to enforce it, etc. And he wanted to do a tribute for the NAACP. And so I produced and directed, while I was still doing the Ellen Show, a show with Burt Lancaster was my narrator host, and I packed it. I had Nat King Cole, Tony Bennett, Edward G. Robinson, Gene Kelly, Bill Cosby's first appearance, Barbara McNair, Edward G. Robinson, Ed Begley, Agnes Moorehead. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I filmed that at CBS, and it went live to Madison Square Garden, to the LA Sports Arena, to arenas all over the United States one day. And that opened the door where I eventually did, which is released right now, called The Tammy Show, Teenage Awards Music International. 10 out of the 13 stars of that show are now inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Wow.
That included the Rolling Stones, James Brown and the Flames, the Supremes, the Beach Boys, Chuck Berry. It was an unbelievable film.
I'm going to have to stop for a second and explain to those people listening to this that we're recording it in the back room of a restaurant in Toluca Lake. So the noise you are hearing is unfortunate but unavoidable. And hopefully it won't drown us out here.
We can help them vacuum the rugs.
Yeah.
Right. But anyway, so that led to a relationship of doing feature films on electronic. It was called Electronovision. And years later, I did another movie with James Whitmore, who won an Academy Award for Give 'Em Hell Harry, which I shot up in Seattle for Sargent.
What was Electronovision?
That was the Tammy Show.
What was the process, though?
It was basically figuring out a way to expand the vertical and horizontal lines. As television was mandated in the very beginning to 525 lines for broadcast.
Right.
Sargent took the electronic cameras and started with other engineers expanding the lines up to 1,100 lines, 1,500 lines, so the quality would get better and better because it had to project on a 30-foot motion picture screen.
Sure.
And it worked in the very beginning with close-ups, but the minute you started to pull back and have wider shots, you would start noticing the inferior quality of the picture on a big screen. So by increasing the lines, he would equal the quality of a close-up.
Gotcha.
And he did Richard Burton doing Hamlet. We did Sammy Davis doing Stop the World, I Want to Get Off, etc. So when I finally left the Steve Allen Show, I got an offer to go to New York to start up for NBC a show in prime time that would rival what ABC had launched called Shindig. And so that was the beginning of Hullabaloo. And Hullabaloo was an 8 o'clock primetime show shot the same place today they shoot Saturday Night Live in Studio 4 in Rockefeller Center. I signed a 13-week contract, went back there, and we had guest hosts, so I got to work with everybody from Paul Anka, Sammy Davis Jr., Liza Minnelli, etc. And it was basically your hit parade for rock and roll. And as I look at it today, it was very tame in those days, especially being on the primetime network. But it was because of the Tammy movie that I did with all these rock stars that got me the job.
Sure.
And in the middle of doing Hullabaloo, I got an offer from Danny Kaye to come back to Hollywood and direct the CBS series that was on.
Danny Kaye Show?
The Danny Kaye Show. So I came back to do Danny. And that was a big show, but Danny and I did not click.
Oh.
And so I wanted to get out of my contract with Danny. And I went to his manager, and Danny said, absolutely not. You have to stay and do the whole series.
Hmm.
But we had some amazing guests on the show. We had Clint Eastwood, that was in a cowboy sketch in those days. We had Shirley Jones, and it was big time, prime time television.
What was your conflict with him in the approach to the show? Or
I think
directing style?
It was a little bit competitive, where I think he resented the fact.
He was such a genius. I imagine he was a controlling guy too.
Well, I wanted to take the musical numbers out of the studio, and nobody did. But I went to Griffith Park to shoot musical numbers, and I had decided to do a number with Shirley Jones and Danny, and he didn't want to do it. And we went out to the park, and I shot with Shirley. She was pregnant at the time, and she was a real trooper. We did a whole bunch of takes on this. It was really, everybody was excited about it. It was all set up to go. Danny came out to shoot his section of the musical number, and I could tell he was half listening to me and half, I don't want to be here. And it turned out where we did a easy rehearsal, but it was he didn't really know the material well. It was, and as a result, I said, okay, let's do another take, and he said, I don't want to do another take, and he stormed off. I said, I'll do outside numbers with guest stars, but I'm not going to do any more with Danny.
Yeah.
He just didn't respect me. I was on stage directing dramatic scenes, and it was like, every time I opened my mouth to tell an actor something, he wanted to direct him. So I just felt it wasn't, those things happen.
Yeah.
It's always a good experience to get fired once in a while.
Oh, of course.
So at that time, I get a phone call from Sammy Davis Jr., and he had just sold a series to NBC. And we'd had some real good experiences on Hullabaloo, and so he wanted me to direct it. So I went to Danny's manager and Herb Bonus, and I said, Herb, since we're not really clicking here anyway, could I leave the show early? I have another offer that I'd like to do. And Herb said, let me take it to Danny, and I'll let you know. I thought there'd be no problem. He came back and said, absolutely not. You have to fulfill your contract, and Danny won't let you out. Well, I lost the job. Sammy said, I can't wait for you. I have to hire somebody else. The day he heard that Sammy got another director, he fired me.
Oh, what a nice guy.
But about a year later, he had a production company called Tina Productions. And about a year later, I got a phone call from his manager, Herb Bonus, saying, would you like to join Danny's production company? He said he's looking for somebody to head it up. And would you be interested? And I said, absolutely not.
Yeah.
So from Danny, I decided to do musical specials. I loved musicals ever since I was a kid. And what really triggered me going into the Army was seeing American in Paris with Gene Kelly. And that was my big...
Oh, boy, yeah.
I love that movie. I've seen it 50 times. And so I decided I want to do specials, but I don't want to do specials where anybody could do them. I want to do specials that only the person that I'm working with could do the special. And if something happened, they got sick, they dropped out, we'd have to throw it all away because it was built around them and their music and their life. So the first specials I did were a trilogy. The first one was in New York with Leslie Uggams. And she was starring on Broadway at the time in a play called Hallelujah Leslie, or Hallelujah Baby. And we did an NBC special called Hallelujah Leslie. And then the next special was Petula Clark. And our guest star was Harry Belafonte. And that's a whole story we won't even have time to delve into now. But it broke the color line in primetime variety television. Of a black person and a white person touching.
She touched his arm or something, right?
Exactly. She touched his forearm during an anti-war song that she wrote called The Paths of Glory, about mothers who send their children off to fight a war for a mountain or whatever and have them not come back and so forth. And NBC didn't want me to do the song, but because Petula wrote it, they gave me permission to do it. I ran across a sponsor in Detroit because it was being sponsored by Plymouth Cars, who was bigoted, and he did not want a black person on the special with Petula. And so that became a pre-battle It's in books and everything now.
Yeah.
But during the song, it was very emotional, and Petula reached over and touched Harry on the forearm, and the sponsor's representative stormed out of the client's booth. And I had shot that song, maybe 5 or 6 takes of it. And as soon as all hell broke loose in the control room and on the stage, NBC fortunately called me in the control booth and said, "We hear something's going on up there, but we just want you to know whatever you're doing, we're behind you 100%. And that got NBC 100% off the hook. I went down to the editing room and insisted that all the takes of that song where they did not touch each other would be erased. And the editor was shaking as he made me sign a release form making him erase all these takes. So there would be no option or choice.
Yeah.
And it became a major article. It was in Newsweek, Time magazine around the world, and it really did open the door to, everybody in America scratching their heads saying, what was that all about? A lot of people thought it was a publicity stunt, but it wasn't. This guy was dead serious.
Yeah.
And out of that, I decided to make movies, and it signed with Walter Wanger, a very famous film producer. And he approached me about making a movie with him of a book he'd optioned. And I was working on that after the Petula Clark special. And I got a phone call from Bob Finkel at NBC saying that Colonel Parker had made a deal with Tom Sarnoff at NBC to do the first Elvis Presley special. And would I be interested? And I said no, because I'm making a movie.
Yeah.
And so my partner at the time was a very famous recording producer. And we recorded exclusively The Fifth Dimension, The Association, Laura Nero, at the prime of their stardom. And he had engineered a record for Elvis. And he said, "Steve, you are crazy. You and Elvis would hit it off great." And I said, "But I'm making this movie." Well, as fate intervened, Walter Wanger died of a heart attack that week.
Wow.
And I was now free because I no more had this obligation to make this movie.
Had you started doing it?
I was in pre-production.
Pre-production.
Yeah, it was already bought and going to be distributed, etc.
Nothing shot yet.
Nothing shot. And so I called Finkel back, and he said, the Colonel has this idea to do a Christmas show with 20 Christmas songs, no dialogue, and the problem is Elvis is balking. We can't get Elvis to the studio, even though the Colonel made this deal with NBC. And part of the deal was they were going to finance Elvis's next movie as well. And so I said that if I could meet Elvis one-on-one alone, just the two of us, I would consider doing it as the producer and director. And so he said, first you have to meet Colonel Parker. So I went out to MGM Studios where Elvis was making a movie. And I met Colonel Parker, and Parker was very charming. And he inducted me in the Snowman's Club, which is a little fake club he had for people that he considered great BSers. And he had a membership card and a booklet and everything else, which I still have, and had my name on it and so forth. And he gave me this quarter-inch album, which was a Christmas album that was sent all over the country to disc jockeys. So they would play the Elvis Christmas album. And he said, "This is the show I want you to do." And he handed me this box, quarter-inch box, with a reel-to-reel tape. Mm-hmm. And I, of course, had no intentions of doing 20 Christmas songs, and if I was going to get involved. But the Colonel approved me, and he said, "I'll set up a meeting with Elvis, and he'll come to your office on Sunset Boulevard." And he did. I had offices at 8833 Sunset, next to Tower Records, glass elevators going up and down. And Elvis showed up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon with his Memphis Mafia, and they came up to my offices, and the entourage stayed in the outer office, the reception area, and Elvis came into my office. And I had, by that time, I'd created a production family from the specials I had done before with Petula and Leslie. So I had my whole team together, and I had in the meeting with me, I had Bones, my partner, and I had Alan Bly and Chris Beard, who were the head writers. And he walked into the room and he sat down, and he was, Bob Finkel had mentioned to me that every time he had any kind of conversation with Elvis, it was always Mr. Finkel, and very respectful and so forth. The minute Elvis walked in, he said, "Hi, Steve," and I said, "Hi, Elvis," and it set that tone. And he said, first question he asked me is, "What do you think of my career?" And I said, "I think your career's in the toilet." He laughed, and he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, we're in the record business as well as television and movies, and I don't see any of your records on the charts anymore in Billboard or Cashbox or Record World." And, he said, "What do you think about television?" And I said, "Well, I think it'll either make you or break you, because, you can do a movie and it takes months, if not years, to find out if you're a box office success or not. But do a television special in prime time, and the next morning you wake up, you're either a hit or you're a disaster." And he said, "Well, to tell you the truth, I'm afraid of television." He said, I didn't like what I had done on television. Milton Berle had me on his show, and he made fun of me with powder puffs. I was on Steve Allen, and he had me in a tuxedo with a hound dog. And and I said, "Well, why don't you make a record, which you do know how to do, and I'll put the pictures to it. You don't have to worry about television." And he liked that. He told me later on that was the key that sold him on me. And we had a great relationship, and it was the first time in primetime television that a special was on the air with no guest stars. That was a big deal.
Just him.
NBC wanted
hour long.
Well, originally I edited for 90 minutes, but when it aired on for Singer Sewing Centers, they cut it down to an hour, which in those days was probably less than 50 minutes, considering all the commercial interruptions. Yeah. But I was very lucky at the time to, just by a fluke, not the show we planned, but I fell into. Elvis wanted to live at NBC, so we cleaned out a dressing room for him, and he moved in there the entire time we shot it at NBC. We rehearsed at my offices on Sunset, shot the show, and rehearsed the dancers at NBC. And every night when we'd finish rehearsing, he'd go into his dressing room, and he would jam until 2, 3 in the morning with all of his guys, and they would just sit around singing the good old days songs, and one of the guys would be pounding on the top of the piano, playing the drums, but no real drums, and another guy had a tambourine and so forth. And I said, "This is better than what we're planning with all these extras and dancers and actors, and I got to get this on tape," which became the beginning of what everybody calls the improvisation segment, where the acoustic sessions, which has been copied on HBO and VH1, and every station's had their version of the acoustic. Exactly. Yeah. And that's what really, everybody realized that Elvis was not a stick figure who, just followed direction. He was a real human being who sweat. In fact, NBC, when I showed him what I had done, because I used the improv as interstitial to the big production numbers when it originally aired, there were a few executives who were saying, "Well, you can't show that. You can see the sweat under his armpits. You can see his hair mussed up and everything." And I'm saying, that's Elvis. That's what America wants to see. Yeah. And so the next day,
he was... Not just a pretty boy?
The next day he was back in business. He had 2 of our songs were originals that we put into the special, "If I Can Dream" and "Memories," and they both went on the charts immediately. Great. Elvis went to Las Vegas, and he was back in business.
How many shows did you do with him before the 68 special was
I
the
was
last?
Persona non grata to Colonel Parker.
Oh, Parker, yeah. Yes, I forgot about him.
Challenged his authority, and Priscilla, who I'm still friends with, told me that Elvis made up his mind that no matter what the Colonel said or told him to do, he was going to follow me and not listen to the Colonel. And that was, when I first started the special, I was offered to be the director of his next film. And immediately when our confrontations began, that was pulled. And I wasn't even allowed to see Elvis Presley after that. I was really somebody the Colonel didn't want any part of.
But when he did the 68 final concert, was Parker out of the picture at that point?
He was there all the time, but we were having all these confrontations because we'd gone from 20 Christmas songs and no dialogue to a very human show, all built around his music, and no Christmas songs.
Yeah.
And it was a fluke that during one of the improv sections, he sang Blue Christmas, but he just improvised it with his guys.
I see.
And when after I edited the show and turned it into NBC, I was called to the tower at NBC. And there was Tom Sarnoff and Herb Schlosser, the program director, and so forth. And the colonel was sitting in the office, and I walked in. And the colonel was glaring at me and staring at me with those big blue eyes and trying to hypnotize me or whatever. And Herb Schlosser conducted the meeting, and he said, "Steve, we have a problem." And I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "The colonel won't allow us to broadcast the show because there's no Christmas songs in it. And do you have a solution?" Mm-hmm. And fortunately, as life is a series of fortunate incidents, accidental incidents in many cases, I said, I think we've got one song that he did during the improv section, Blue Christmas. And so Schlosser looked at the colonel and said, "If we take a number out and put Blue Christmas in, will that satisfy you?" By that time, the colonel had lost every battle imaginable. And the colonel, looked at Schlosser and looked at me, and he said, "I guess that'll do." But he wasn't happy about it. And so we put Blue Christmas in, and then the show aired. And then when he died, NBC rushed out a 3-hour version of Elvis as a tribute with Anne Margaret hosting. And somebody who didn't know the history of what had gone on ran down to the vault and pulled my 90-minute edited copy off the shelf instead of the 48 minutes that originally aired. And that's how it came to be a 90-minute special. And since then, there have been so many, incarnations of the original special that they've used every foot of footage
of it. Yeah,
exactly.
Boy. We're running a little bit late on time here, Steve.
I'm just at the beginning of my career.
I know you are. Well, go on and tell us a little bit more, but a little bit faster.
Well, sure. I did a bunch of specials. I did Liza Minnelli's first special with Kander. John Kander of Kander and Ebb wrote that with me. Tony Newley was a guest star on it. I went to England and shot a film as part of the Lucy series on CBS, and we did Lucy in London with Anthony Newley and a slew of major guest stars. And it was then that I did another feature film with James Whitmore and Gibb Harry. I did another film with the original star of Baywatch, Nicole Eggert. And I then produced and directed the Mac Davis series for NBC. I did in 2 years and about 3 or 4 Christmas specials. And then I did a slew of ice specials. I was allowed into the Disney vault and using gold medalists from the Olympics. Michelle Kwan, who did not win the gold ever, but was, Michelle Kwan's a legend in ice skating. Christy Yamaguchi, Kurt Browning, Dorothy Hamill. I mean, I did a bunch of those, and I did Aladdin in Cairo, Egypt. I did Mulan, Disney's Greatest Hits, and so forth. And that was, they were all primetime specials broadcast on ABC or CBS.
Tell us about the Star Wars holiday special.
Well, Star Wars Holiday Special was interesting because I got a call from the producers, Smith Hemian, who were, ironically, Dwight Hemian, and we will miss him, was a great variety specials director.
Absolutely.
And Dwight was my predecessor in a way, though we never worked together. Well, we did work together. I actually produced and directed the National Emmys for 4 seasons, 4 years on the wheel, going from each network every year. And Dwight and Gerry Smith were the executive producers, and I was the line producer-director of those shows. But Dwight was the original Steve Allen director in New York. I became the Steve Allen director on the West Coast. And we both specialized in doing specials, and I was kind of a few years behind Dwight in my career and from the West Coast. And anyway, they were the executive producers of the Star Wars Holiday Special. They made a deal with George Lucas. Lucas wanted to sell toys to kids and decided the best way to do it was to go on television and do a Star Wars special with the original cast and guest stars and make a variety show out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And Lucas, I guess, chose the director. And so they shot at Warner Brothers on this enormous film stage. And I got the call when they shut down because they were way over budget the first week. And they were in deep trouble of the whole project going away. And so I got a call from Gerry Smith saying, will you come in as a fireman and direct this special, because otherwise, it's going to fall apart, and we want to come out to Warner Brothers, look at the set, tell us what to do, but we're going to shut down for a week until we get reorganized and see if we can start up again. Well, I went out there and I realized right off the bat their problems, because they were set up to do it with a one camera film shoot, and this was a multiple camera shoot in order to get it done, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And they sent me the script and said, okay, here's the script on Wednesday, we want you to start shooting on Monday. So I had no directorial, I wasn't able to change anything or
No.
what. I just had to come in and be the fireman and get it shot
Sure.
if I were to do it. And the thought of working with the Lucas behind the scenes team of, really great people.
Pretty exciting.
And the staff and the cast itself, the entire cast, I couldn't turn it down.
No.
And unfortunately, it was a story about the Wookiee family. And as you know, the Wookiee families just grunt. They don't talk.
Yeah.
So the first 10 minutes of the special was basically no dialogue, other than I think they had subtitles in it or whatever. And I was on another project and couldn't even get involved in the post-production of it. It had Art Carney as a guest star, Diane Carroll as a guest star, and a few others. And I found it to be a fantastic experience. I was working with the whole Smith-Hemian, Steve Binder world of technical people, including the Lucas people. It was a real challenge every day to get the scenes shot, and the stunts and so forth. Only, I think, America was expecting to see Star Wars, the movie. And nobody had bothered to explain to the people, this is not Star Wars, the movie. This is a television special for kids to buy the toys when they do the commercial breaks.
Yeah.
As a result, when it aired, and I think I was out of the country when it aired, it became a cult favorite. It became the rotten apple.
Oh.
The reviewers were looking at it like this should be a Lucas multi-million-dollar, hundreds of millions of dollars to do Star Wars, and in reverse, they got a television special with a variety and musical numbers.
Something they weren't expecting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I have no apologies for it. I think we got it shot. We got it shot on schedule. The last number, which was the big finale, we had run out of all money, so we had no set. We had the entire cast plus about 100 extras. And I decided to just go to the local candle store and buy thousands of candles. And that became our set. And it worked. I mean, I thought it was really kind of, I'm sure the public had no clue what was going on behind the scenes. But it was a totally positive experience as far as I'm concerned. I was very, proud of it. I wished it was a different script, to be honest with you.
Yeah, sure.
But I had no control over that.
Wow. Amazing. Well, your career has been absolutely fantastic. And it's not over yet. What are you doing now?
I'm still working. I'm developing projects. I left out a whole section where I became a partner in Talent Associates with in the 70s, and with Dan Melnick, Leonard Stern, David Susskind, and I was brought in to head up the television division, and I started a record company, and that was the beginning of the launch of Seals and Crofts, the musical act.
Mm-hmm.
I signed them, started a label, very successful producing team named Lambert and Potter that had many hit records.
Yeah.
Then I had actually started another record company and brought Rick Springfield over from Australia to launch his career. I'm working with an Italian artist now named Nico, who has already played Carnegie Hall, and he'll be in the United States in September and October, and I have great hopes for his career. And
I've heard him. He's good.
I heard a philosophy once that, we're all born to solve problems. Mm-hmm. And then we go through a whole series of, 70 to 100 years of solving problems, then it's time to go and leave it for the next generation.
Exactly.
So I have no thoughts of retirement. I love what I do. I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I went to China with John Denver. I did a John Denver special called Montana Christmas Skies. Mm-hmm. For a kid who grew up in Los Angeles and barely got to Tijuana until I was 19 years old, to have climbed the Great Wall of China, to been at the pyramids in Cairo, Egypt, been all over the world. I mean, it's an amazing joyride, and I've been really fortunate to have this career.
And you've gotten married along the way, and you have
a
family?
Beautiful wife. Yeah, I have two beautiful daughters, and now I have 3 stepchildren through my wife's previous marriage. And I have one of my stepsons is a doctor and anesthesiologist in Ventura. Mm-hmm. And I'm real proud. I have grandkids now, and I love them to death. And I think we're closer as a family today than we've ever been in our whole lives, because the downside of the career that I've kind of quickly sketched for you is that it takes a lot of time. The director is usually the first person to open the door and the last person to close the door and leave.
That's
and
right.
I'm sure there are many years I'd like to take back and say I wished I'd spent a lot of time or more time with my family, because I think family is what it's all about.
That's right. But directing is a big job, as you say. You're the guy who gets the blame or the not necessarily all the praise.
I've never ever complained about responsibility. I want responsibility. I want to make decisions, and it's not that I'm a control freak. I believe in family. I believe once you get in this think tank of creativity, forget the titles, forget the salaries. You're there for a purpose.
Good people in your camp.
Absolutely. And I think in the business, what I've learned is that the language we're supposed to speak is English, but I think there's hundreds of languages within that you have to speak art director language, you have to speak writer language, you have to speak engineering language, et
and
cetera,
lighting
et cetera.
language.
Exactly, and you have to communicate with it. They know a lot more than you know in their specialties, but you have to be able to communicate with them in terms of the images in your head, et cetera. And I think I owe my whole career to people who've opened up and been really great to me, and I've never been afraid to ask a question and be honest. I think that's really the bottom line.
There you go.
You don't want to fake it. You want to go in there and say you know what you know and you don't know what you don't know, and people are there to help you.
Yeah. We forgot one, executive's language.
I got a call from an executive not that long ago, and they said, "Steve, how come your specials are so expensive?" And I said to her, "Have you ever heard the word quality?"
Yeah.
And it's not how fast you can do it, and how it's for me. It's always been about no matter what I chose to do, I wanted to do the best I could do it. And I haven't even cared about the reviews or the ratings. Some of the best shows I've ever done, they've probably been panned and criticized, and yet some of the shows that I felt, gee, if I only had another chance to do it again, I've won awards with, and I have been the recipient of an Emmy and an ACE award and this award and that award, but it doesn't. It's subjective.
Sure.
This is a business of subjectivity.
Absolutely.
And my tagline and my mantra is, whatever you do, do with passion. Passion is everything.
And you do that very well.
Thank you.
Steve Binder, our guest today in Toluca Lake, actually Burbank, right next to the Warner Brothers studio at the Toluca Lake Tennis Club.
Where the rugs are now vacuumed.
Where the rugs are now vacuumed and the tables are set up for tonight's dinner, I trust, and I hope the noise hasn't been too great.
Thank you, Gerry.
I've been speaking with Steve Binder on this 7th day of June in the year 2010. My name is Gerry Fry. I'm the audio historian for Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters, and we thank you very much for listening.